How do you build one of the richest cities on Earth and end up with no one living in it? That is the question Ordos forces us to confront, and it begins with a promise so bold that, at the time, almost no one dared to doubt it. In the early 2000s, deep in Inner Mongolia, Chinese officials unveiled a vision that sounded unstoppable. A brand new metropolis, rising from the grasslands, financed by unimaginable wealth from coal. Not a gradual expansion, not a small experiment, but a fully formed, modern city designed almost overnight. Wide avenues, monumental squares, luxury apartment towers, museums, opera houses, government complexes. Ordos was not meant to grow slowly. It was meant to arrive complete, a symbol of China's unstoppable future. On paper, everything made sense. The Ordos region was sitting on one of the largest coal reserves in the world. Local governments were suddenly drowning in revenue. Land values exploded. Money poured in faster than planners could count it. If wealth was the engine of urban life, Ordos had more fuel than it could ever burn. Officials spoke openly about millions of future residents. Investors lined up. Developers competed to build bigger, taller, faster. The message was clear. This city would never struggle. It would dominate. But even in its earliest days, subtle cracks were already forming beneath the concrete. Ordos was not growing out of organic demand. It was being declared into existence. Instead of people pulling a city into being, the city was trying to pull people toward it. Entire neighborhoods appeared before there were schools filled with children, before businesses had customers, before communities had time to form. Streets were paved before footsteps existed. Windows reflected sunlight, but no lives were reflected back. Construction moved at a pace that felt unreal. In just a few years, Kangbashi district, the heart of New Ordos, transformed from empty land into a futuristic skyline. From above, it looked alive. From the ground, it felt eerily unfinished, like a movie set waiting for actors who never arrived. Streetlights worked, elevators ran, water flowed. But the most important element was missing: people. At first, this absence was easy to ignore. Early on, officials dismissed concerns as impatience. Cities take time, they said. Residents will come. And for a while, belief was enough. Apartments were bought not to be lived in, but to be held. Ownership mattered more than occupation. Empty units still increased in price. Paper wealth expanded, even as human life failed to follow. This was the moment when Ordos quietly crossed a line. It stopped being a city in the traditional sense and became something else entirely. A financial construct, a monument to confidence, a bet placed at an urban scale. Buildings existed as assets, not homes. Neighborhoods functioned as balance sheet entries, not communities. And as long as prices kept rising, no one wanted to ask the obvious question: what happens if the people never come? Walking through Ordos at night during those years felt unsettling. Entire districts illuminated, glowing with neon and street lamps, yet silent. No traffic, no conversations drifting from windows, no rhythm of daily life, just wind moving between towers that were technically complete, but spiritually empty. A city that looked alive from afar and felt abandoned up close. The strangest part was that nothing had failed yet. There was no disaster, no collapse, no visible crisis. Money was still flowing, construction still continued, officials still spoke confidently, and that made Ordos far more disturbing than a ruin or a disaster zone. This was not a city that died. It was a city that never truly lived. And that raises a deeper, more uncomfortable question. If Ordos was built with more money than most cities will ever see, if it had modern infrastructure, government backing, and global attention, what exactly went wrong at the very beginning? Because the answer is not found in the empty streets themselves. It's hidden in the decisions that made those streets empty in the first place. If this story already feels unsettling, take a moment to pause and really think about what Ordos represents. A city built with limitless money, flawless infrastructure, and absolute confidence, yet somehow missing the one thing that gives any city meaning. Understanding why this happened matters, because Ordos is not just a strange anomaly in China. It's a warning, and warnings only work if we actually pay attention to them. If this mystery has you questioning how a place like this could exist, leave a comment right now and tell me what you think went wrong first. Was it greed, blind optimism, political pressure, or something even deeper? Make sure to like this video if you want to see these hidden stories fully uncovered, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the truth behind Ordos only gets more disturbing. From here, the money behind Ordos didn't just arrive quietly, it exploded. And that explosion is the key to understanding how a city could become impossibly rich before it ever became real. Everything begins with coal. Beneath the dry grasslands of Inner Mongolia lies one of the largest coal reserves on the planet. For decades it was there, valuable but restrained by limited demand and slower development. Then, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, China's industrial growth accelerated at a historic pace. Power plants multiplied, steel production surged, cities expanded, and suddenly, coal wasn't just fuel, it was leverage. Ordos became one of the wealthiest regions in China almost overnight. Local governments that had once managed modest budgets were suddenly collecting massive revenues from mining rights, land leases, and energy-related taxes. Money flowed in faster than administrative structures were prepared to handle. Officials faced a new problem. How do you spend abundance without precedent? The answer, at least on paper, was development. Urban development on a monumental scale. In China's political and economic system, growth is not just encouraged, it is rewarded. Officials are evaluated, promoted, and remembered based on visible progress. Roads, buildings, districts, GDP numbers. A city rising from nothing is far more impressive than slow, careful optimization. Ordos offered the perfect stage: endless land, endless money, and a national narrative obsessed with speed. So the wealth from coal didn't go into gradual community building. It went into concrete. Massive, immediate, irreversible concrete. Entire districts were financed up front. Infrastructure budgets ballooned. Architects were instructed to think big, not just functional, but symbolic. Government buildings designed to project power. Cultural centers meant to announce global relevance. Residential towers planned not for current demand, but for imagined future millions. The logic was simple: build now, people will follow later. At the same time, another force quietly amplified the problem: speculation. As Ordos's wealth became public knowledge, real estate turned into a financial magnet. Apartments weren't marketed as places to live, but as guaranteed investments. Prices rose quickly, then faster. Units were bought by investors from other cities who had no intention of moving. Some buyers never even visited their properties. Ownership papers mattered more than keys. This created a feedback loop detached from reality. Rising prices justified more construction. More construction justified optimistic population forecasts. Optimistic forecasts reassured investors, and investors in turn pushed prices higher. It was a closed system, feeding on confidence rather than people. On balance sheets, Ordos looked unstoppable. In lived experience, it remained hollow. What made this phase especially dangerous was that nothing appeared broken. Roads were flawless. Utilities worked. Buildings were new. There was no decay, no visible neglect, no dramatic collapse. From the outside, critics seemed irrational. How could something built with so much money be fundamentally wrong? But inside the system, the distortion was growing. Wealth was no longer serving human need. It was serving momentum. Projects were approved because budgets existed, not because demand did. Construction schedules were driven by political cycles, not demographic ones. The city was expanding, faster than trust, culture, or habit could form. Even local residents of the broader Ordos region felt disconnected from the new city. Housing prices in Kangbashi were far beyond what ordinary workers could afford. The coal wealth that financed the city did not translate into accessibility. The very money meant to create life pushed life away. By the time concerns became impossible to ignore, the scale was already overwhelming. Billions had been poured into structures that could not easily be repurposed. Empty apartments were not temporary gaps. They were structural outcomes of how wealth had been deployed. Ordos had become rich in the most dangerous way possible, faster than it could understand itself. And that leads to the next question. If the money was real, the buildings were real, and the infrastructure was real, why didn't human behavior follow the script planners expected? Why didn't people move in simply because the city existed? Because that answer exposes the most, critical miscalculation of all. The planners of Ordos believed in a simple, seductive idea. If you build a city grand enough, people will come. History, however, rarely rewards cities that assume human behavior can be engineered on command. Kangbashi district was designed for more than 1 million residents. Its scale reflected absolute confidence. Broad boulevards stretched farther than the eye could track. Apartment towers rose in orderly clusters, each one promising modern comfort, status, and a place in China's future. Schools were constructed, hospitals were completed, cultural landmarks stood ready for crowds that never arrived. Yet year after year, the population refused to materialize. The mistake was not architectural, it was psychological. Cities do not function like factories. You cannot turn them on simply by finishing construction. People do not move because buildings exist. They move because opportunity, habit, affordability, and social gravity pull them. Ordos offered impressive structures, but it failed to offer reasons strong enough to uproot lives. Most of the people expected to fill Ordos already lived elsewhere. They had jobs, family networks, schools for their children, informal support systems built over decades. Moving to Kangbashi meant abandoning those ties for a place that, despite its beauty, felt socially empty. A city without neighbors is not neutral. It is intimidating. Even those who considered relocating faced a hard economic truth. Housing. Prices in Kangbashi were wildly out of reach for ordinary workers. The city was built with coal money, but priced for investors. Apartments were marketed as assets, not homes. Rents were high. Ownership required capital far beyond local incomes. The people who worked in Ordos's coal industry, service sectors, or nearby towns could not afford to live in the very city their labor financed. This created a silent contradiction. The city needed residents to function, but its economic structure excluded them. There was also the issue of timing. Ordos attempted to skip the messy middle stage of urban growth. Most cities begin imperfectly: crowded streets, mixed-use buildings, informal commerce, chaotic neighborhoods that gradually organize themselves. Ordos tried to leap straight to a finished, polished version of urban life. The result was sterility, without small businesses struggling to survive, without street vendors adapting to demand, without overcrowded schools and improvised solutions. The city never developed rhythm. Everything worked, but nothing lived. The environment felt controlled rather than inhabited. At night, this absence became impossible to ignore. Lights illuminated empty roads. Traffic signals changed for cars that never came. Security guards patrolled plazas with no pedestrians. The infrastructure performed flawlessly for an audience that didn't exist. For potential residents visiting for the first time, the experience was unsettling. It felt less like moving into a community and more like stepping into a simulation. Social proof matters more than planners admit. People move where other people already are. They choose neighborhoods that feel active, safe, and established. In Ordos, each empty building reinforced the next. Every vacant tower silently told newcomers, No one else chose this either. Government efforts to seed population struggled against this reality. Offices relocated, incentives were offered, and some public employees were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to move. But forced presence does not create organic life. Many commuted from older parts of Ordos, or left after short periods, unwilling to raise families in a place that still felt unfinished. What made this failure more profound was that it wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, quietly, year after year. No single decision killed Ordos's dream. Instead, thousands of rational individual choices, not to move, not to stay, not to commit, accumulated into collective absence. The city had everything except momentum, and once momentum is lost, it is brutally hard to recover. Empty cities don't just lack people, they generate doubt. Doubt spreads faster than hope. Investors hesitate. Families wait. Businesses stay away. The gap between intention and reality widens with each passing year. By the time officials acknowledged that something was deeply wrong, Ordos was already defined by what it lacked, rather than what it offered. And that leads to a more uncomfortable realization. If human behavior was misread this badly, then the problem was never just economic. It was conceptual. The city was planned as an outcome, not as a process. And when cities are treated as finished products instead of living systems, the consequences tend to be irreversible. From the outside, Ordos looked like a technical success. Roads aligned perfectly. Utilities ran without interruption. Buildings met modern standards. On inspection reports and government briefings, everything appeared correct, and that is precisely what made the failure so dangerous. The real mistakes were invisible. The core problem was not corruption in the crude sense, nor a lack of engineering skill. It was something far more subtle, a planning system built to reward speed, scale, and appearance, rather than long-term human behavior. Population forecasts for Ordos were not simply optimistic, they were inflated by design. Officials projected millions of future residents, based on economic momentum, rather than demographic reality. Growth targets were set first, and justifications were built around them later. Once a number was politically convenient, it became functionally unquestionable. Every report, every proposal, every development phase aligned itself to that assumption. No one wanted to be the voice that said, "What if they don't come?" In China's administrative structure, local officials are evaluated through performance metrics tied to visible development, GDP growth, infrastructure expansion, land value increases, a city rising rapidly from empty land signals, competence and ambition. A cautious, incremental approach signals hesitation. In that environment, slowing down is risky, politically and professionally. So Ordos accelerated. Entire districts were approved simultaneously, rather than sequentially. Instead of testing demand with small neighborhoods, planners committed to full-scale completion. Residential, cultural, and governmental zones were all constructed in parallel. This eliminated flexibility. Once built, the city could not easily adapt if assumptions proved wrong. Another critical error lay in the separation between planning and lived experience. Decisions were made through top-down models, simulations, and benchmarks borrowed from other cities. Many of them coastal, densely populated, and economically diverse. Ordos was none of those things. It was landlocked, resource-dependent, and geographically isolated. Yet it was planned as if context did not matter. Human behavior was treated as predictable input rather than variable reality. Planners assumed people would relocate because infrastructure existed. They assumed cultural institutions would attract life simply by being present. They assumed employment would follow buildings instead of recognizing that employment must precede relocation. Each assumption reinforced the next, creating an internally consistent model that collapsed only when confronted with real people making real choices. The housing strategy compounded the issue. Large portions of residential stock were designed at price points aligned with speculative investment, not local wages. This was not accidental. High prices boosted land sale revenues and made balance sheets look strong. But they also locked out the very population meant to inhabit the city. In effect, Ordos optimized for financial optics rather than occupancy. There was also a quiet manipulation of timelines. Officials spoke of temporary emptiness, framing low population as a short-term phase. But no clear thresholds were defined. How empty was too empty? How many years constituted failure? Without benchmarks, delay became denial. Each year of low occupancy was explained as patience rather than warning. Meanwhile, maintenance costs accumulated. Empty buildings still require heating, security, repairs, and utilities. Streets still need cleaning. Systems still age. The longer the city remained underpopulated, the more expensive it became to simply preserve the illusion of readiness. One of the most damaging miscalculations was psychological. Planners underestimated how strongly emptiness repels future residents. Once a city earns the label of ghost town, reversing that narrative becomes exponentially harder. People do not want to be pioneers in places associated with failure. The stigma itself becomes infrastructure, invisible but powerful. By the time corrective measures were considered, Ordos was trapped by its own scale. Downsizing was impossible. Repurposing entire districts was prohibitively expensive. Admitting failure threatened political reputations. So the city remained suspended between ambition and reality. Too big to abandon, too hollow to thrive. This is the paradox at the heart of Ordos. Every decision made sense within the system that produced it. And yet, together, those decisions created something profoundly dysfunctional, which leads to the next layer of the story. Because while officials planned and investors speculated, something even more detached from reality was happening quietly inside Ordos. A massive real estate bubble where homes were bought, sold, and valued without ever being lived in. And that bubble would shape the city's fate in ways no planner publicly acknowledged. By the time anyone began questioning whether Ordos would ever fill with people, the city had already taken on a second, more dangerous identity. It was no longer just an urban project. It had become a financial instrument. Apartments in Ordos were not bought to be lived in, they were bought to be held. This distinction matters more than it seems. In a healthy city, housing is primarily shelter. In Ordos, housing became paper wealth. Ownership itself was the product, not residency. Entire towers were sold out on launch day, yet remained completely dark at night. Keys were never collected. Doors were never opened. Homes existed only in contracts and spreadsheets. The logic driving this behavior was deceptively rational. Prices kept rising. Coal money kept flowing. Land values climbed year after year. As long as appreciation continued, occupancy was irrelevant. An empty apartment still generated profit on paper. In some cases, it was preferable to keep units vacant to preserve resale value and avoid wear, taxes, or rental complications. This created a city optimized for absence. Developers responded exactly as the market encouraged them to. High-end finishes, standardized layouts, and rapid construction schedules prioritized speed over livability. Neighborhoods were built all at once, not in phases. There was no incentive to wait for demand, because demand was assumed to exist indefinitely. Rising prices justified new projects, which in turn reinforced the belief that prices would continue to rise. A self-reinforcing illusion took hold. Banks played their role as well. Mortgages were issued against properties, whose value was measured not by income potential or occupancy rates, but by recent sales comparisons. If one empty apartment sold for a high price, it validated the next. Risk assessments relied on momentum rather than fundamentals. As long as prices moved upward, the system appeared stable. But beneath the surface, nothing was circulating. No tenants, no local spending, no organic economic activity feeding back into the city. Retail spaces stood empty because there were no customers. Small businesses avoided opening because foot traffic never formed. Without daily commerce, the city could not generate the rhythms that make urban life self-sustaining. Ordos had become a closed financial loop. This was not immediately visible in official data. GDP figures still looked strong due to construction output. Land sales continued to boost government revenue. On paper, Ordos remained a success story. But the success was hollow. Value existed only as expectation, not as use. The danger of this kind of bubble is that it delays recognition of failure. Traditional warning signs, unemployment, overcrowding, declining infrastructure, never appear. Instead, the city looks pristine, silent, frozen at peak condition. And because nothing seems broken, no urgent correction is triggered. Meanwhile, the gap between price and reality widens. Eventually, confidence begins to fracture. Investors notice how long properties remain empty, stories spread, media attention shifts, a label forms. Ghost City. And once that label sticks, perception turns against the market with brutal speed. What was once seen as a guaranteed asset begins to look radioactive. When prices stopped rising, there was nothing underneath to support them. Owners discovered they could not easily sell. Renting was difficult because demand never existed. Maintenance fees accumulated, taxes still applied. An asset designed to be passive suddenly became a liability. And because so many units were held by absentee investors, there was no resident population to stabilize the market. The bubble did not burst with an explosion. It deflated slowly, quietly, through stagnation. This is what makes Ordos different from classic real estate crashes. There was no visible ruin, no half-built structures abandoned mid-construction. Instead, there were complete buildings that had never served their intended purpose. A city that skipped collapse and went straight to paralysis. And that raises a disturbing question. If a city can be fully built, fully financed, and fully owned, yet still fail to function, then what does success actually mean in modern urban development? Because Ordos was not just an economic miscalculation. It was a warning about what happens when cities are treated as investment vehicles instead of places for human life. And that warning becomes even clearer when we examine what living in Ordos was actually like for the small number of people who did move there. For the few who did move to Ordos, daily life revealed a truth that statistics and aerial photos could never capture. A city without people does not simply feel quiet, it feels wrong. Residents described an unsettling contradiction. Everything worked, yet nothing felt alive. You could step into a spotless elevator, ride to a high floor, and look out over kilometers of empty streets and identical towers. At street level, sidewalks stretched endlessly without footsteps. Traffic lights cycled through colors for cars that never arrived. Parks were landscaped, fountains ran, benches were installed, and still no one sat there. The absence changed behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Simple tasks felt heavy. Grocery shopping required long trips because few stores could survive without customers. Restaurants opened briefly, then closed. Cafes that should have been social anchors stood empty, staffed by workers waiting hours for a single order. Children had schools, but few classmates. Parents worried about isolation more than safety. A city designed for millions left families feeling exposed rather than supported. At night, the psychological weight deepened. Silence in a city is different from silence in nature. It feels artificial. People reported hearing their own footsteps echo across plazas. Apartment buildings glowed sporadically, a handful of lights scattered across dozens of floors. From inside those apartments, residents felt watched and alone at the same time, surrounded by infrastructure but starved of interaction. Security became a strange paradox. Crime rates were low, But fear was high. Empty spaces amplify anxiety. Long stretches of road without witnesses, underground parking garages with no activity, public spaces where help feels distant, even if it technically exists. Parents avoided letting children walk alone, not because of danger, but because emptiness itself felt unsafe. Social life struggled to take root. There were no crowds to join, no spontaneous encounters, no informal networks. Making friends required deliberate effort. Community events felt staged rather than organic. Without density, chance disappeared. And without chance, cities lose one of their most powerful engines, unplanned connection. Some residents tried to adapt. They formed small clusters, meeting regularly, sharing resources, creating micro-communities inside vast empty districts. But the scale worked against them. A handful of people cannot animate a city built for millions. Their presence felt temporary, fragile, easily erased. Over time, many left. Not because Ordos was unlivable in a technical sense, but because it was exhausting in a human one. Living there required constant emotional compensation. Residents had to convince themselves that emptiness was temporary, that life would arrive later. But years passed, and later never came. Those who stayed described a creeping realization. They were not early settlers. They were placeholders. This lived. Experience exposed the final flaw in Ordos's design. A city is not just infrastructure plus time. It is infrastructure multiplied by interaction. Remove interaction, and even the most advanced city becomes a shell. Ordos functioned perfectly as a machine. As a habitat, it failed. And once people began leaving instead of arriving, the city crossed a psychological threshold that is almost impossible to reverse. Because cities do not die when buildings decay. They die when people stop believing that staying makes sense. And that belief, once lost, is rarely regained. By the time officials openly acknowledged that Ordos was in trouble, the problem was no longer emptiness alone. It was reputation. And reputation is far harder to rebuild than concrete. The first response was denial. Public statements emphasized long-term vision, patience, and inevitability. Ordos was described as a city still warming up, a project simply ahead of its time. But as international media began labeling Kangbashi a ghost city, that narrative collapsed. Once the image spread, no amount of optimism could contain it. So the strategy shifted from confidence to intervention. Government agencies launched campaigns to force life into the city. Public offices were relocated to Kangbashi. Civil servants were encouraged, and in some cases pressured, to move. Universities were instructed to open satellite campuses. Hospitals were expanded. Subsidies were offered to families willing to relocate. Rent discounts appeared. Tax incentives followed. On paper, the response looked comprehensive. In reality, it exposed a deeper weakness. People moved because they had to, not because they wanted to. New residents arrived with one foot already out the door. Many commuted back to older districts where social life still existed. Others treated their apartments as weekday dormitories, returning to their original homes on weekends. The city gained bodies, but not roots. Population statistics ticked upward, but community did not. Marketing efforts tried to reframe Ordos as a misunderstood success. Promotional videos highlighted clean air, open space, modern design, and opportunity. But these messages clashed with lived reality. Viewers saw empty streets behind the slogans. They heard silence behind the promises. The gap between image and experience widened. Attempts to import culture followed. Concerts were staged. Art festivals were organized. Public squares hosted events meant to simulate urban vibrancy. For brief moments, the city felt alive. Then the events ended, and the emptiness returned. Artificial energy could not replace organic density. Even businesses were courted aggressively. Companies were offered cheap office space, tax breaks, and infrastructure support. A few moved in, most left after incentives expired. Without a local consumer base, operations were unsustainable. A city cannot be propped up indefinitely by subsidies without becoming dependent on them. Perhaps the most revealing effort was the attempt to normalize Ordos through comparison. Officials pointed to cities that took decades to fill. They argued that ghost phases were normal. But this comparison ignored scale. Ordos was not slightly oversized. It was massively overbuilt. The timeline required to fill it naturally would span generations, not years. Behind closed doors, planners faced an uncomfortable truth. Ordos could not be fixed in the traditional sense. It could only be managed. Maintenance budgets were cut. Certain districts were quietly deprioritized. Some buildings were left unused intentionally to reduce operating costs. The goal was no longer full occupation, but controlled survival. Keep parts of the city functional, prevent visible decay, avoid total collapse. This marked a fundamental shift. Ordos was no longer a future megacity. It was a cautionary asset, something to be contained rather than celebrated. And yet, even in this managed state, Ordos refused to disappear. Its emptiness became symbolic. Journalists, economists, and urban planners around the world began pointing to it as evidence of something larger, a structural flaw in how modern development thinks about growth. Which raises the next question. If Ordos is not unique, if it is not simply a Chinese anomaly, then where else is this pattern repeating? Because once you know how to see it, Ordos stops looking like an exception and starts looking like a prototype. Once Ordos entered the global conversation, it stopped being just a city in Inner Mongolia. It became a reference point, a name shorthand for a deeper, repeating pattern that could be found far beyond China's borders. Urban planners and economists began noticing echoes of Ordos in places that, on the surface, had nothing in common. In Spain, entire housing developments built during the mid-2000s real estate boom sat half empty after the financial crisis. Perfect roads, fresh paint, modern utilities, and no buyers. In Ireland, ghost estates dotted the countryside, products of speculative belief that demand would always catch up. In parts of the United States, master-planned communities rose on the edges of deserts and suburbs, built years ahead of population growth, many stalling before life fully arrived. Even within China, Ordos was not alone. Dozens of so-called new cities followed a similar trajectory. Some eventually filled, many did not. The difference often came down to proximity, economic diversity, and timing. Ordos was isolated. It relied on a single resource, and it scaled too fast. Those same ingredients appeared again and again wherever cities were treated as investment platforms rather than lived environments. What tied these cases together was not geography or politics. It was mindset. Modern development increasingly assumes that capital can replace time, that if enough money is deployed quickly, human systems will reorganize around it. But cities are slow organisms. They grow through layers of habit, trust, and informal exchange. When that process is bypassed, the result is not acceleration, it is fragility. Ordos exposed a dangerous belief. That infrastructure alone creates demand. In reality, infrastructure amplifies demand that already exists. It rarely creates it from nothing. Where jobs, culture, and networks are absent, roads and buildings become hollow frames. They wait, sometimes indefinitely, for life to arrive. Another repeating element was speculation detached from use. In each case, housing was treated as a financial product first and shelter second. Empty units were not seen as failures but as acceptable pauses in appreciation. This mindset normalized vacancy. Over time, vacancy stopped being temporary and became structural. Once vacancy becomes normal, cities lose momentum. There is also a psychological contagion at work. When people hear ghost city, they avoid it. When investors hear it, they hesitate. When businesses hear it, they stay away. The label feeds itself. Recovery becomes exponentially harder, not because conditions cannot improve, but because belief does not. What makes Ordos especially important is that it happened at the scale of a modern metropolis, in an era of advanced data, planning software, and economic modeling. This was not a medieval city abandoned by plague or war. It was a contemporary urban experiment that failed in plain sight, under the assumption that control and capital could eliminate uncertainty. They could not. As climate change, demographic shifts, and remote work reshape how people choose where to live, the lessons of Ordos grow more urgent. Building ahead of demand is tempting. It promises control. But without humility toward human behavior, it repeats the same mistake under new branding. Ordos is no longer just a place. It is a warning embedded in concrete. And that brings us to the final tension in this story. If Ordos represents a systemic flaw rather than an isolated error, then its true legacy is not emptiness. It is the uncomfortable mirror it holds up to modern development itself. Because the question is no longer what happened in Ordos. The question is, how many Ordos are being built right now, quietly, before anyone notices? As Ordos became shorthand for failure, something quieter began to happen beneath the headlines. The city stopped being a warning about China and started revealing something deeper about how modern societies understand progress itself. What Ordos exposed was not just a planning mistake, but a collective illusion, the belief that growth is inherently visible, measurable, and immediate. In this worldview, success looks like cranes on the skyline, rising GDP charts, and freshly poured concrete. Anything that cannot be photographed from above or counted in quarterly reports becomes secondary. Human life falls into that blind spot. In Ordos, everything that mattered to planners was visible. Roads, towers, public buildings, infrastructure. Everything that mattered to residents was invisible. Relationships, routines, trust, belonging. And when forced to choose, the system consistently favored what could be counted over what could be felt. This mindset does not belong to a single country or ideology. It appears wherever development is treated as performance. Cities increasingly compete with each other not to be livable, but to look successful. Iconic skylines, cultural megaprojects, and master-planned districts are deployed as signals to investors, to governments, to global audiences. Ordos was an extreme version of this logic, but not an unusual one. What made Ordos collapse inward was that it reached the end of the performance. Once the buildings were complete, there was nothing left to signal. And without people to animate the space, the performance ended abruptly. There is also a moral discomfort embedded in Ordos's emptiness. It represents excess at a time when housing shortages exist elsewhere. Entire cities built but unused, while millions struggle to find affordable places to live. The contrast unsettles not because it is inefficient, but because it feels wrong. Ordos forces an ethical question. Modern planning often avoids. Who are cities for? Are they for balance sheets, investment flows, and political milestones? Or are they for daily life, imperfect growth, and human unpredictability? Ordos answered that question unintentionally, and the answer disturbed many who studied it. Over time, the city began to appear in textbooks, documentaries, and lectures. Students were shown images of empty boulevards and told this was what happens when abstraction replaces lived reality. Ordos became a cautionary tale taught in universities far from Inner Mongolia, a symbol of misaligned incentives and misplaced confidence. Yet the most unsettling aspect is this. Ordos did not fail dramatically. It did not collapse, riot, or decay into ruins. It simply stalled. And stalling is harder to confront than collapse. Collapse demands response. Stagnation invites denial. A stalled city can exist for decades, absorbing resources quietly, neither dead nor alive. That limbo is where Ordos remains, functional, maintained, but unresolved. And that unresolved state leaves us with one final question. If Ordos never truly lived and never fully died, then what is it now? The answer to that question defines its legacy and determines whether it will remain a warning or become a blueprint repeated elsewhere under a different name. Ordos today exists in a strange in-between state, not a ruin, not a success, but something far more unsettling, a city permanently suspended between intention and reality. It never collapsed in flames. It was never abandoned in panic. It simply stopped becoming. Buildings remain standing. Roads are maintained. Lights still turn on every night. But the momentum that turns infrastructure into life never arrived in sufficient force, and once that window closed, it never fully reopened. What Ordos ultimately represents is the cost of mistaking possibility for inevitability. Planners assumed that wealth guarantees population. Investors assumed that appreciation replaces use. Officials assumed that time alone would solve absence. Each assumption felt reasonable on its own. Together, they created a city that functioned perfectly as an object, and failed as an organism. The most haunting aspect of Ordos is not its emptiness, but its completeness. These are not half-built towers or crumbling ruins. They are finished homes that were never lived in, schools that waited for children who never enrolled, plazas designed for crowds that never gathered. The city skipped decay and went straight to irrelevance. And irrelevance is harder to fight than failure, because failure invites correction. Irrelevance invites silence. Years later, Ordos still appears in reports and documentaries, often framed as a lesson already learned. But that framing is dangerous. The conditions that produced Ordos have not disappeared. Cheap capital, political pressure for visible growth, real estate treated as a store of value, planning models that prioritize scale over sequence. These forces are still active, globally. Ordos is not a historical anomaly. It is an early signal. As populations age, birth rates decline, remote work reshapes geography, and climate pressures intensify, the idea that cities can be summoned by money alone becomes increasingly fragile. Building first and hoping life follows is no longer just risky. It is irresponsible. The real tragedy of Ordos is not that it failed to attract residents. It is that it consumed resources, land, labor, and attention that could have strengthened existing communities instead of attempting to replace them. It stands as a monument to excess confidence, a reminder that growth without grounding creates volume, not vitality. Ordos never lived, but it also never disappeared. And perhaps that is its final role, to haunt planners, investors, and governments with a simple, uncomfortable truth. Cities are not built, they are grown. And anything that tries to shortcut that process risks becoming another Ordos, under a different name, in a different place, repeating the same silence. If you've watched this story all the way to the end, take a moment to reflect on what Ordos truly represents. A city built for millions that never lived, a place of ambition, wealth, and planning gone wrong, and a warning for the future of urban development everywhere. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Comment below with your theory about why Ordos never became the city it was meant to be. Was it greed, poor planning, misreading human behavior, or something else entirely? Your insight matters. If this video held your attention, make sure to hit the like button to show your support, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more deep dives into the world's most mysterious urban stories. And before you go, check out the next video appearing on your screen. It continues exploring cities that should have lived, but never did. Don't miss it.